Hey there, class. It's Faisal coming at you with your class of the day for June 5th for grade 12 college English. So, first of all, your essays are due today. They should be handed in through the Google Classroom, just as you have been doing thus far. They're due at midnight, and yeah, please get them in as soon as possible. Please give me a little bit of time to mark these things because, well, essays do take a little bit of time to mark, and do know that I usually send back the mark as soon as I finish, right? So if you have friends in the course, you might have, like, your friend might get their mark tomorrow, but you might not get your mark until Wednesday. Just be patient. I am marking them, but essays are longer. Just like you worked hard on your essay, I want to work hard on marking your essay. So be patient, all right? Now, if there's any problem and you can't hand it in on time, just let me know. Talk to me. You know me. I'm not eager to hit anyone with late marks or zeros or anything like that. So just tell me what's going on, right? Communicate. Anyway, so we're now finished with the essay part, at least for now, and I want to look ahead now to what is left in the course. So the main thing that's left, of course, is our novel, which is The Hound of the Baskervilles, right, which I've linked before, but I'll put another link in today. Before we start talking about the book, let's talk about what we're going to be doing with the book, right? Because, you probably are wondering what kind of evaluations we'll be looking at. So my intention is that we're going to be reading this over the next 2 weeks or so. And over the course of 2 weeks, I will be posting things, not just about the book itself, but about writing and about other issues, right? And my intention is we're going to have some questions on the text every day, just like the short story questions. Not every day, actually, but probably about 3 a week, right? So that we have 6 in total by the Friday after next, right? So we're going to have questions on the text. Some will be oriented less towards reading marks and more towards writing and even media marks. I would love it if I could show you guys one of the movie adaptations of the film. There's one on YouTube which is not very good, right? I would love to show you the Sherlock version, right, with Benedict Cumberbatch and all that. That's on Netflix, if you guys have Netflix, right? And I would love to have you guys watch that and tell me what you think of that version versus the one we have here, right? That would be interesting. But we'll see if that's possible, right? Let me look into that. Anyway, so that's gonna be the first thing, right? So you're gonna have the short answers, just like we did for short stories, every week, 3 a week, right? Until you have 6, and I'll be marking those in the same way. We'll also have our Google Meetups every week, which will be your oral communication mark, right? So make sure you come and participate in those, right? We're gonna have 3 of those in total, so there'll hopefully be a lot to talk about, right? We'll be talking about the story, and you'll have opportunity to ask questions, just like we've been doing. And the very last thing is there is going to be one more essay, right? I always like to make sure to do at least 2 essays in a course, right? So that whatever mistakes you made in the first essay, you will be able to correct in this next essay, right? That'll be worth about 20% of your grade. It'll be on the Hound of the Baskervilles and its themes. The last day of class is, I believe, June 26th, so it will be due then, right? So that's what we're building up towards, right? So those are the 3 things we've got left in the course, and once you've done those, you will have finished the course. All right? So, Hound of the Baskervilles. Actually, before I start talking about this, let me mention that one student bought the Amazon link that I gave earlier for this book, right? Because they wanted an actual book. Unfortunately, it was missing pages, so I don't know what's with that. Guys, again, you should be able to get The Hound of the Baskervilles in any bookstore, right? And it should cost about $10, right? But if you can't find a decent copy, it is all available online, right? I'll link this website again, right? Sherlock Holmes is out of copyright, right? So it is not illegal for me to give this to you, right? It is anyone in the world can have this for free, right? Or at least the text. So when you buy it, just know that you're buying some paper, right? You're not buying the actual book, right? Because it's over 100 years, and that means that the book is out of print, right? So that's the case for any book, by the way. If a book is more than 100 years old, then it's available for free. At least the text is, right? Obviously, you still have to pay for the paper. Anyhow, so in terms of this book, let's talk about it. So it's a Sherlock Holmes story, and fortunately for you guys, you already know the basics of who Sherlock Holmes is and what he's all about. So essentially, this is a longer version of one of those stories, right? It still follows the same principles. You've still got Sherlock Holmes, the brilliant detective, on one side, and you've still got Dr. Watson as his sidekick and as the narrator on the other, right? Who's there to, tell you about what's going on in the story, right? Just like we've been talking about. So, let me tell you a little bit about the author before we go on, right? I've talked a little bit about Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, but I wanted to share just a little bit more information about him, because he himself was an interesting sort of guy. Because he's the guy who made Sherlock Holmes, and, he liked it at first, but after he wrote a couple of these stories, he actually really started to hate it, right? People loved Sherlock Holmes, but the actual guy writing the stories hated Sherlock Holmes, right? And he thought it was such an annoying thing to write Sherlock Holmes stories. He would try to write them as quickly as possible so that he didn't have to think about them that much, because he thought that these stories weren't serious enough for him. And what he wanted to write about were things like philosophy and history instead, right? He didn't want to write detective stories. He wanted to write about, the nature of the world and all of this kind of stuff. So he was the guy who thought of Sherlock Holmes, but he actually quite thoroughly hated it, right? And what he would do is he would charge more and more money for publishers so that they would stop asking him to write the stories. And every time he said, you know what, fine, I'll charge you even more to write these stories, he assumed that they would leave him alone. But no, they would say, okay, fine, we'll give you money. And he would write the stories for that reason, right? So essentially, he would write Sherlock Holmes stories whenever he needed money, because he would just, people would throw money at him for it, right? But what he really wanted to do was write about philosophy and history and all that kind of stuff instead, right? So that was kind of a funny thing about him. So, in terms of this story, what had happened is eventually he got so fed up with Sherlock Holmes that he killed him, right? So he wrote a story where Sherlock Holmes is killed, right? He's killed by a guy called James Moriarty, who you don't have to worry about. So he's killed by this guy. Sherlock Holmes is dead, right? Killed by the author because the author is sick of him. And there was a public outcry from the fans, right? His fans were mad that Holmes was killed. They started to write angry letters. And this is probably the first time in human history where the fans of a piece of literature actually had a revolt and got angry at the author, right? And people were, very upset, saying, "How could he kill Sherlock Holmes? What is this guy doing?" Nowadays with Twitter, this happens all the time, right? With television shows or novels or anything really. But his fans were furious after he killed Sherlock Holmes. So what he did is, first of all, he needed money again. And second of all, people were angry at him because they wanted more Sherlock Holmes. So what he did is he wrote The Hound of the Baskervilles as a longer novel, and it's set before the unofficial death of Sherlock Holmes. Or, well, the official death, I should say. It's not unofficial. So essentially he wrote this to sort of make the fans happy again and also make more money. Later on, he brought Sherlock Holmes back to life for real, right? So it found out that Sherlock Holmes didn't actually die. But the guy, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, he always hated Sherlock, right, from beginning to end. You would never be able to know this reading the stories, by the way, but he always hated it, and he wrote these stories essentially for the money, right? For him, the Sherlock stories were always just a distraction from what he really wanted to do with writing about philosophy and history. By the way, his philosophy and history stuff was nonsense, right? It's kind of funny. I don't want to go too far into that, but essentially the guy believed in fairies, right? He's sort of the opposite of Sherlock Holmes. But here we are. So that's some of the background to this novel, right? When it first came out, people were very excited because Sherlock Holmes was dead, but now the author had brought him back, and people were like, "Oh wow, it's Sherlock Holmes again. We love this," right? So he had a huge following back then. So, the Hound itself is essentially, again, a longer version of the Sherlock Holmes mysteries with a lot of twists and turns. And as always, you have got to get to the end of it for it to make sense, right? Mysteries make sense in the end. So, as you read it, you're going to have to pay attention to the details. So, uh, I know you guys are finishing your essays, right? Some of you are still wrapping it up, so I'm not going to go too deep into this right away, right? I'm not going to, assume you guys have read the first chapter or something. So instead, let me just say, I know it can kind of suck to read a long story through a screen or through a phone, right? But you do get used to it. And again, if you can purchase the book, please do so. I will put a different Amazon link, by the way, so that you can maybe get one that doesn't have any defects in it. So, nevertheless, let's take a quick look at just the first couple of paragraphs here so that we know what we're dealing with. So let's see. Chapter 1, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Mr. Sherlock Holmes, who was usually very late in the mornings, save upon those not infrequent occasions when he was up all night, was seated at the breakfast table. I stood upon the hearth rug and picked up the stick which our visitor had left behind him the night before. It was a fine, thick piece of work, bulbous-headed, out of the sort which is known as a penong lawyer. Just under the head was a broad silver band, nearly an inch across, to James Mortimer, M.R.C.S., from his friends of the C.C.H. was engraved upon it, with the date 1884. It was just such a stick as the old-fashioned family practitioner used to carry, dignified, solid, and reassuring. Well, Watson, what do you make of it? Holmes was sitting with his back to me, and I had given him no sign of my occupation. How did you know what I was doing? I believe you have eyes in the back of your head. I have at least a well-polished, silver-plated coffee pot in front of me, said he. But tell me, Watson, what do you make of our visitor sick? Since we have been so unfortunate as to miss him and have no notion of his errand, the accidental souvenir becomes of importance. Let me hear you reconstruct the man by an examination of it. So, here is something that happens a lot in Sherlock Holmes stories, but we only got a little of it in the two stories we read, right? Where, again, Sherlock Holmes is going to examine something that was left behind or something that's part of a person's appearance and see what he can conclude about it, right? So, uh, here what we have is a walking stick with an engraving in it, right? So a stick to help someone walk, and it was left behind in Sherlock Holmes's rooms by a visitor who they missed, right? So someone came to visit and left behind this stick, and that's where our story is going to begin. So, for this weekend, I think it would be a good idea to read the first, let's say, 3 chapters. I don't think that's too much, just down to here, right? So if we could read the first 3 chapters just so that we can get a sense of what this mystery is. Of course, you can always ask me questions, and we will pick it up from there starting on Monday. All right? So I hope your essays are going well. I will look forward to reading them. And I thank each of you for working so hard. And remember, there are only 22 days left in the course. So we're going to get through this, and then we'll be finished. All right? So thanks so much for reading or listening, and I will see you guys next time.